Sometimes it all just clicks. It's the King of Fighters R-1 on Game Boy Works Gaiden. Unless you're coming into this video series knowing nothing whatsoever about SNK's short but splendid handheld legacy, you know exactly where all of this is going. That's right, infinite portable fighting games. And we begin here with the King of Fighters R-1. What constitutes a killer app? It means different things in different places. At Outback Steakhouse, for example, killer app means an onion, deep fried so intensely it will stop your heart. Once they made a Tron game called Killer App, which is funny because it wasn't. But for Neo Geo Pocket, Killer App means the King of Fighters R-1. What makes this game so damn special, you may ask? Well, come on, just look at it. Actually, looks alone don't do this game justice. No question, it has fantastic art and animation, but the real proof is in the play. And when it comes to play, KOF R-1 demolishes everything that came before it in the portable space, which by 1998 was quite a few fighting games. I mean, the Game Boy hit the peak of its initial pre-Pokemon popularity right around the time that Street Fighter II Mania swept the nation. I don't have a specific nation in mind with that expression, by the way. Street Fighter II Mania swept every nation. So despite being poorly suited for matching the speed, complexity, and visual splendor of 1990s fighting games, the Game Boy naturally played host to many portable fighters. Heck, the earliest of those predate Street Fighter II. Shoei stuck Fist of the North Star 10 Big Brawls for the King of the Universe on Game Boy before the end of 1989. It wasn't a good or complex fighting game, but it certainly fit the prerequisites of the genre. And really, aren't we all just here on a technicality? By 1998, the Game Boy had seen a bunch of fighters, including a surprisingly tolerable port of Street Fighter II itself. And as it happens, the developer behind that port, Sun L, had ported a few of SNK's fighters to Game Boy for Takara, who seemed determined to bring that set of fighting properties to every platform conceivable. Even Game Gear got some fighters, mostly courtesy of Takara. And heck, for that matter, Atari even put Pit Fighter on Lynx, so even that system gave you the option of duking it out mano a mano. Despite being technically unsuited to fighting games, which typically involve large characters moving quickly with many elaborate unique animations and complex interactions, portable systems also made perfect sense as a home for fighters. After all, each and every portable console worth playing from Game Boy onward placed heavy emphasis on connectivity between systems, allowing two players to link their handhelds and compete head-to-head. Again, the fighting genre really put a strain on this tech. Game Boy's Link protocol in particular was sort of bodged together and not really suited for the fast responses and transmission rates that come hand in hand with the format. But developers gave it their best effort. While the King of Fighters 95 on Game Boy wasn't going to replace the Neo Geo version as the go-to interpretation of that game in anyone's book, the Neo Geo version had the disadvantage of not being a version you could play on the school bus. And to be fair, even once the Neo Geo Pocket arrived, you still couldn't play the Neo Geo version of the King of Fighters on the bus. KOF R-1 does not directly port the arcade game to handheld form. How could it? The Pocket offered less pixel resolution than its AES and MVS siblings. Not to mention that whole lack of color. Also, there was the only having two face buttons thing. The thing of it is, the King of Fighters R-1 doesn't try to deliver an authentic arcade experience. Instead, it reinvents the King of Fighters from top to bottom. The intent here was not to cram a top-flight arcade experience into a tiny system, but rather to reinterpret the source material into something that would feel like a top-flight experience tailored to that tiny system. In that respect, SNK delivered. And I do mean SNK. The majority of games on Neo Geo Pocket and NGP Color were programmed by second-party SNK partners like Saurus, Yumikobo, and Saknoth. But for this, the flagship of the Neo Geo Pocket line and the template for the system's extensive lineup of fighting games, SNK put its own staff on the case. That accounts for a lot of its excellence right there. Admittedly, many of the team credits on KOF R-1 show up as pseudonyms that only appear elsewhere on other Neo Geo Pocket titles, but it also contains enough known names to link this cartridge not only to SNK's earlier arcade and console work, but also to give it some serious bona fides that go beyond portable or Neo Geo connections. Foremost among these is the presence of Masato Ishizaki as the lead planner. Ishizaki came to SNK from Irem, where he worked as a composer and designer on a number of arcade and Famicom titles. Significantly, he worked on Kung Fu in arcades as one of his first projects. In other words, Ishizaki had been there at ground zero for the entire fighting genre. Because, as anyone watching this series should know, Kung Fu was the primal soup from which fighting games emerged, especially King of Fighters. Sure, other brawlers and fighters entered the mix around the time that Kung Fu first appeared in arcades. For example, Data East had Karate Champ, and Konami had ER Kung Fu, both influential works that more directly established the idea of one-on-one martial arts combat in video games. Kung Fu's strength came from the involvement of one Takashi Nishiyama, the IRIM designer who came up with the game's innovative mix of low, forward, and jumping attacks that could consist of either punches or kicks. Nishiyama left IRIM for Capcom after shipping Kung Fu, and immediately expanded on his earlier work with Trojan, which added weapons and blocking to the mix. A year later, Nishiyama surgically transplanted those principles from the scrolling brawler and into the one-on-one martial arts combat game, the original Street Fighter. At that point, he left Capcom for its crosstown rival SNK and helped come up with the entire Neo Geo hardware model, in which the arcade cabinet could use interchangeable cartridges. This premise came from the same pool of inspiration as Data East's Deco system and Nintendo's Versus concept, but Takashi's approach had a key distinction. The Neo Geo coin-op cabinet would also ship as a consumer-oriented console, enabling owners to play perfect arcade experiences at home with no compromises. Well, besides to their bank accounts. Around the same time, Capcom said, that Street Fighter was pretty cool. We should do a sequel to that. But enough about Street Fighter 2010. Heyo! No, seriously, Street Fighter 2 arrived in arcades less than a year after the Neo Geo AES hit the living room of that one kid in your class who was kind of insufferable about his privilege, but everyone pretended to like him because, well, he had Magician Lord at home, and that was kind of cool. Street Fighter 2 became the best-selling and most profitable arcade game since Pac-Man, which was probably sort of annoying to Nishiyama. So he did what any aggrieved creator whose work had been built on by someone else to become a global smash without him would do. No, he didn't sue, this was in America. Objection! He made his own Street Fighter successor. Called Fatal Fury King of Fighters, Nishiyama's new fighter harnessed the power of the Neo Geo platform to incorporate an innovative dodge mechanic that allowed players to switch planes of movement into the background. It essentially integrated the third dimension into a 2D fighter in a slick, intuitive way. Fatal Fury arrived about half a year after Street Fighter 2, making it the first fighter on par with Capcom's hit to arrive in arcades, and it therefore became a hit in turn. SNK quickly followed it with more fighters, including a sort of prequel series called Art of Fighting. Both Fatal Fury and Art of Fighting played distinctly from Street Fighter 2, in large part because the 6-button combat of Capcom's cabinet wasn't possible on the 4-button MVS cabinet. Since SNK had designed the MVS cabinet to be a permanent fixture hosting interchangeable cartridges, they were more or less locked into this setup. So Nishiyama and his peers had to make the best of things, and they did. The simpler MVS interface meant that many players found the SNK fighting style more intuitive than the Street Fighter 2 format, and it made for faster play, something Capcom would repeatedly push toward with their own incremental Street Fighter 2 upgrades, which they pushed out in rapid succession in response to fan-made bootlegs and hacks that enhanced the base original. But arguably the real heart of SNK's fighters came from its cast of characters. Unlike most post-Street Fighter 2 games, which tended to just carbon copy the Street Fighter 2 cast, SNK's characters had their own distinct looks, fighting techniques, and backstories. And the few SNK brawlers who did seem conspicuously to Street Fighter guys, such as the Ryu Ken-like Ryo Sakazaki, were pretty much a fair cop since Nishiyama had helped create those characters in the first place. SNK leaned into the characters and lore of their games right away, commissioning director Masami Obari to direct a motion picture adaptation of Fatal Fury, which, if nothing else, meant that Obari's core creative strengths did wonders for Mai Shiranui's popularity. Around the same time that Fatal Fury the motion picture hit, SNK published the grand unifying theory of its fighting cosmos, the King of Fighters 94, taking its name from the American subtitle of the original Fatal Fury, whose Japanese title had actually translated into something like The Hungry Wolf Legend, The Battle of Destiny. The King of Fighters 94 brought together characters from both Art of Fighting and Fatal Fury, tossed in some folks from other unrelated SNK games, added a few original fighters, and let fans go nuts. The King of Fighters 94 raised the bar for the fighting genre. At a time when everyone else was mostly just giving us Street Fighter 2 but worse, and even Capcom had fallen into a rut of incremental iteration, the King of Fighters 94 presented players with the biggest and most varied fighter yet seen. SNK crammed 24 whole characters into their tournament fighter, including all the favorites from their previous fighters and a bunch of newcomers. All of SNK's mainline fighters were represented here outside of Samurai Showdown, since that took place hundreds of years before the Southtown saga existed and wouldn't have made any sense. Still, the King of Fighters did pull some inspiration from Samurai Showdown, adopting its power gauge mechanic to enable players to store up energy for extra powerful attacks. In any case, the King of Fighters 94 had far more to offer than simply a massive character roster. Its big innovation came from the way it organized these fighters. King of Fighters 94 didn't focus on individual character selection so much as team selection. Its fighters competed as groups of 3, and this team dynamic informed the entire game. For starters, the team system replaced the best-of-3 standard popularized by the Street Fighter games. Rather than fight in rounds until one character runs out of stamina, which resets play to kick off the next round, face-offs in King of Fighters 94 felt more like single continuous events. Players would select their preferred predefined team and establish combat order. The first character on each team would face off, duke it out, until one of the competitors fell due to stamina depletion, at which point that character became inaccessible for the remainder of the bout, while their second would step in. The rival who dealt the knockout blow would remain in action until running out of stamina themselves. Both teams would run through their trio of characters in this manner until all 3 members of a team had been knocked out of action, and the victorious team would move along to the next bracket of the tournament with their stamina restored. The introduction of the team dynamic gave the King of Fighters a rhythm unlike any fighter before it. Although the game forced players to swap characters upon their defeat, anyone could optionally swap in one of their active, which is to say conscious, characters from the sidelines at any time as a tag-in. It made for a more demanding take on the fighting game than the standards of the era, since it required players to master 3 fighters instead of focusing all their time on a single preferred character. As a trade-off for making this investment, the team mechanic allowed players immense flexibility that would later be mirrored by games like Pokémon, giving you the power to sub in a character who could better counter your current rival. In standard one-on-one fighting games built in the style of Street Fighter II, you always just had to make do with your current fighter against whatever opponent the computer or second player decided to throw at you. So if you were playing, say, Dhalsim, you'd be kinda screwed once Chun-Li came up in the rotation. With the team system, you'd be able to tag out Dhalsim in favor of someone capable of better countering Chun-Li, like say Guile. That is, you could have done that if Street Fighter II had offered that feature in 1994 when the King of Fighters 94 debuted, which it didn't, so you couldn't. No, in 1994, Capcom had just released Super Street Fighter II, which was considerably faster than the original game and allowed you to play mirror matches and use some new attacks for certain characters, but really it was just a rowdier Street Fighter II with 4 new guys to play as. No wonder the King of Fighters went over so well. In no time flat, King of Fighters became SNK's flagship fighter, supplanting the series that inspired it. Those other games never went away, but the King of Fighters became the baseline, not only for SNK but for competitors' games too, and for SNK's crossovers with other companies. So needless to say, the King of Fighters R-1 for Neo Geo Pocket was kind of a big deal. Brought the King of Fighters series into portable form with style and grace, setting a new standard for handheld fighting games that wouldn't come close to being matched for several years, once Game Boy Advance and PlayStation Portable settled in and made more direct arcade conversions feasible. But again, R1 didn't attempt to convert the Neo Geo series to the monochromatic portable. That would have been impossible, and not just because of the lack of screen resolution and color depth. The Neo Geo Pocket only featured 2 face buttons versus the MVS's 4, meaning that the strong, weak punch-kick system couldn't translate directly to the handheld. SNK's developers wisely stepped back and rethought the entire concept of the King of Fighters here, streamlining it to strip away details that wouldn't work in the portable format and revamping it to take advantage of the system's strengths. For starters, they gave the property a visual overhaul, changing the characters from the detailed adults seen on Neo Geo to chunky little cartoon characters in the Pocket. The Takara conversions of SNK's fighters to Game Boy had already dipped a toe into these waters, redrawing each roster of pugilists into squat, rounded effigies of their Neo Geo selves, but R1 pushed that visual redesign philosophy even further. R1's characters took on a hyper-exaggerated look, with massive heads atop compact bodies that stretch and distort comically as they move around. And every single character still looks totally recognizable. It helps that the Pocket's processing power allowed the system to push around bigger sprites than older handhelds could. The fighters in R1 stand around 40 pixels in height, which makes them a fair bit larger than all but the most oversized characters in previous portable fighting games. But what really makes these characters work is that they all share a consistent, unified, highly stylized appearance. Every character's body is about as wide as it is tall, and the artists completely abandoned their impulse to make use of shading for the sake of modeling. Rather than attempting to draw the fighters as rounded objects in space, R1's sprite designers went with an unshaded cartoon look that flattens out the characters and allows the screen's limited color depth to define their outfits and individual features. The King of Fighters R1 directly adapts the series' most recent arcade entry at the time, the King of Fighters 97, and while it only manages to cram in about half the Neo Geo's cast and teams, 15 versus nearly 3 dozen, it makes them count. Every brawler plays like their coin-op counterpart, carrying forward most, if not all, of their trademark moves, and they all look and move like exaggerated, yet highly faithful versions of themselves. The final boss of R1, Iori Yagami, possessed by the Orochi, demonstrates the same dazed bloodlust of the Orochi Iori seen in King of Fighters 97, even though he appears to be about half the real Iori's height and shows up on-screen in 3 shades of grayscale. And the same goes for all the other folks in R1 as well. It's a real feat of visual design, and it might actually be the Pocket's greatest success. The visual style SNK adopted for R1 would echo throughout the platform's extensive lineup of fighters, and so would its fluid action and crisp controls. Despite the Pocket's lack of a third and fourth button, the King of Fighters R1 plays better than any fighting game before it had dared dreamed on a portable system. SNK managed to convert the standard Fatal Fury and King of Fighters 4-button control system onto the Pocket's 2-button setup by making use of a timing-based input system. Quick button taps cause your selected fighter to deliver a light blow, while holding an attack button results in them rearing back for a more powerful strike. The setup pairs remarkably well with directional inputs to give each and every fighter access to their full range of combat skills, despite the scaled-down hardware. Speaking of directional inputs, that's where King of Fighters R1 truly shines. The Pocket's Neo Geo CD pad style control stick offers much greater input precision for the diagonals that factor so heavily into fighting games than a standard 4-directional D-pad or the fully analog sticks that have begun to manifest on contemporary consoles. With its clicky, tactile, gated 8-directional design, the Pocket's stick allows players to perform semicircular motions or hit pure diagonals with ease, which makes playing the King of Fighters R1 a true pleasure. As with its graphical style, future NGP and NGPC fighters would adopt R1's control systems, creating a sense of consistency across the platform and allowing developers to mix and match play elements for crossover titles, like Match the Millennium and Gals Fighters. I mean, you could certainly argue that SNK went a little too hard on fighters in the Pocket family's tragically brief life, but can you blame them? If anyone else had come up with a portable fighting formula this good, they'd have milked the hell out of it too. And it's not like SNK came anywhere near expressing the potential of their fighting setup in R1. Again, the game only features about half the fighters of its console counterpart, and it offers a pretty bare-bones collection of play options compared to subsequent releases. You can play a team-based tournament or simply follow a single character through the story mode, and you can select either simple or advanced controls depending on how much direction you want to have over some of the more complex features like the power gauge. The 15 fighters here all do their Neo Geo counterparts justice, but they're all pretty much the high-profile characters you'd expect to see in a portable King of Fighters. Ryo, Kyo, Iori, Terry, Mai, Yuri, Athena, and newcomers like Shermie and Chris. That left a whole lot of deep ventures available to appear in the inevitable sequel, hinted at right there in the title. And indeed, the King of Fighters R2 would be a more or less completely new game, rather than a simple color overhaul like Baseball Stars Color. But that's getting ahead of ourselves. The King of Fighters R1 is a masterclass in visual and game design, a portable adaptation of an arcade hit that feels deeply faithful to the source material while working on its own terms to make the most of the platform. It's a true milestone for the medium, and I say this as someone with no real aptitude for fighting games in general, and SNK fighters in particular. This is how you do it, handheld enthusiasts, and the only thing keeping the King of Fighters R1 from being an absolute runaway hit was the fact that, well, the Neo Geo Pocket barely even existed before being replaced by a better version of the same thing. Next time on Game Boy Works Guide In, I hope you're ready for some football, or, as we call it in these uncivilized lands, soccer.